Welcome to the Random Encounter Show. I'm DeathStalker V. We can even do it from the table, guys. We don't have to start standing up, do we? In this episode, we're going to be having what I call table talk, or basically a free-form conversation on whatever topic of interest it is to me of the day. In this table talk, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite tabletop role-playing games of all times, none other than Castles and Crusades. Castles and Crusades has been a topic that has been highly requested here on the show. DeathStalker V pays attention to you. We just move slow. Okay? Hey. But I pay attention to you guys. And in fact, we're running a poll over on the community tab of some games that are up next for you guys to pick which one we're going to do a deep delve of, like we're doing for Tunnels and Trolls now. Castles and Crusades so far is in the league. Or, did I say league? Lead. So it's probably going to be something we see very soon, a deep delve treatment of. Now, I think since the beginning of this show, and even before this show with DeathStalker V, but just here on this show, Castles and Crusades has been one of the most talked about systems when I've interacted with you in the community. By the way, if this is your first time here, I'm horrible at reminding people to do the whole beg for people to like and subscribe. I don't do that. I'm not a dog begging for tricks. But if it's your first time here and we're covering things that interest you, feel free to join our community. That's what we are here on the Random Encounter Show. The Random Encounter Army, baby. Come on. The most elite group in hobby gaming around that I've seen. Trust me. Join up, subscribe to the channel. We have a Facebook group, the Random Encounter Army. Put a link down below. You get to really directly communicate and involve yourself here more so than YouTube allows us with the comment section. But back to what I was saying. Castles and Crusades, more people have came to me on the Facebook group and just messaging me and comments and stuff, asking me about Castles and Crusades. And Castles and Crusades, I have preached. I have preached the gospel of Castles and Crusades for years now. Sometimes on other YouTube channels, sometimes just out and about in the gaming community. And it is one game that I have to say that everyone I've recommended it to, and they actually went and checked it out, they have become a convert over to Castles and Crusades. Many of them leaving things like 5th edition, Dungeons and Dragons, and Pathfinder and such. And that's really what I want to talk about, is what's the appeal of Castles and Crusades, at least from me. Now, to do that, we have to talk about another topic that we don't talk so much about here on the Random Encounter Show. We need to, I'm a big fan of old school Dungeons and Dragons, not a fan of modern Dungeons and Dragons, but we need to talk about it more. So this table talk gives us a chance to really sit down and sort of talk about both. Now, why are we involved in both things? Well, number one, Castles and Crusades is actually a Dungeons and Dragons clone. But in the world of clones, what do you guess? There's thousands of them, of DnD clones. In the world of clones, it stands just high and mighty. It has a throne, in my opinion. And it actually is my favorite edition of Dungeons and Dragons, even though it doesn't go by the name of Dungeons and Dragons. It acts as a Rosetta Stone to Dungeons and Dragons. It picks up what Dungeons and Dragons was originally looking for and what it eventually lost. Okay, it picks up the pieces and it's amazing. And we'll talk about this. We'll talk about it. And I need to clean this table. We got the holiday special coming, guys. I'm so excited for the holiday special. I'm not going to lie to you. Not to get off topic too far. We're coming back. Don't worry. We're coming back. But later this month, we're having the holiday special. We've got some guests lined up that's going to make appearances on the show. People have been sending in gifts and cards and stuff. It's lining up that I think it's going to be the most amazing episode that the Random Encounter show has ever produced. You know, I mean, it wouldn't be hard, right? You got a camera shy guy up here that doesn't bother to edit anything and just freeform talks with no script or anything. Not hard to beat it, but no, guys, it's really looking like it's going to be something special. You're going to be hearing from a lot of the friends of the show that we've had over our first year together, and from other YouTube channels and from some companies and things. I'm so excited. I can't believe the response we've had for it. So I'm very excited about that. Just throwing it out there, if you want to send a card or letter to the show, a video greetings or something of that nature, contact me and we'll get it done, because the time is starting to run a little bit short according to what you want to do. But I'm so excited. Now, picking back up, we said Castles and Crusades is essentially what old school DnD was looking for, and where modern DnD completely lost itself. It picks up all those pieces. Now, I don't talk about DnD a lot here because I don't play a lot of DnD anymore. When I think of Dungeons and Dragons, two things come to my mind. First off, the original iteration of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, this is the Mold Vase set. This is the oldest set that I own. But the original iteration of Dungeons and Dragons, you could call it Basic. You could call it BECMI. Basic, Expert, Champion, Mortal, or Immortal. That set. You know, White Box. Classic D&D. You know, that came out in 1994, which is truly its own sort of forgotten or obscure edition of Dungeons and Dragons, because it did some stuff similar to Basic and some stuff that wasn't so similar. So I really consider it its own thing. But that's off topic. We'll show that one day, because it's the greatest box set TSR ever released and the greatest box set I've ever owned. Yeah, maybe I should have brought it over here. Oh well, it's on the shelf. What do you want? But that's when I think about when we talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And I also think about first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You know, if somebody wants to play Dungeons and Dragons, and it has to be by name. Pretty much, if we're not playing Basic D&D or First Edition AD&D, I'm not really interested. Now, I'm not just some person that's, you know, a grognard stuck on an edition. That's absolutely not true. I've tried and own most all edition of Dungeons and Dragons. I've tried every edition of Dungeons and Dragons. The only one I never bought into was second edition. For whatever reason, second edition, I would rather have played first edition, but I would actually truly rather play Basic when it comes to D&D. That's where the magic's at. It's in first edition as well, but it loses a little. You know, but I'm not some grognard that's stuck on an edition. I absolutely love these two editions. I've played these two editions a whole lot. I've had some really fantastic memories and wild days and nights playing D&D with my friends, especially as a kid. Nowadays, for my Dungeons and Dragons fix, you know, if I want something very similar to this, but with more well thought out and presented rules, Swords and Wizardry Complete Rule Set, you know, is my go-to. It's the top of the line OSR game for me. And for everything else, if you know, if we're gonna play anything else, a class and level system, it's got to be Castles and Crusades. It's got to be. So let's talk about D&D again, guys. I'm getting lost. Where are we? Who am I? Okay. Old school D&D. What it was looking for. I guess we should start out. The old school D&D was looking for something. When D&D hit the scene, 1974, it was the first thing. It was the pioneer. It was the game that started the entire industry and hobby of tabletop role-playing games. Every single role-playing game that exists now is basically because of D&D. They owe D&D their origins. That's just a blanket statement, and I'm sure that somebody wants to argue or something, but I'm very comfortable there's not a role-playing game in existence that doesn't owe its origin to Dungeons and Dragons. Now, when the original iteration of Dungeons and Dragons released, the rules, we've talked about this before, the rules were very badly organized. They were pretty incoherent in many places, and there was large chunks of the rules that were just flat out missing. Over the course of the next few years, they re-released that rule set. You know, you got the home set, you've got the BX and Expert mold vase sets, you got the BECMI set. Now, what was going on with that? Why so many sets? Because they were trying to make the rules more coherent for people. And really make them more complete. When Dungeons and Dragons first kicked off, the idea of the role-playing game at the time was you would take your characters and you would go into underground dungeons or tunnels or labyrinths or whatever. You would kill monsters and you would get treasure. That was mostly part of the game. It came from wargaming, miniature play and stuff. Instead of you having armies, you just commanded single units. And you played the character of a single character. You know, you played that character. That was you in the game. You made decisions for it. You took it into combat, etc. But the hobby around role-playing quickly evolved from just that. People like Ken St. Andre saw that, and he liked the idea that, hey, role-playing in a fantasy world sounds great, but I don't want to play a miniatures game. I want something that has story, that has, adventure to it and more things. Even at D&D, like the Hickman Revolution, concepts came around that, hey, maybe there's an outside world that these characters partake in. That when they're not underground. Hey, maybe these characters are in the underground world or are running around adventuring and looking for loot and treasure and killing things. Maybe there's a story behind that, a reason for it. Maybe we should connect these adventures and make them into like a saga or a campaign. Those concepts weren't set in stone when D&D first hit the scene. It would take over the course of years for those concepts to hit, and each iteration of the basic rule set would bring those concepts to the rule set itself in some form or fashion. Other people, we just talked about Ken St. Andre. They saw D&D, and many of them homebrewed D&D because D&D wasn't a complete rule system. Basic D&D, mechanically to this day, is not a complete rule system. It doesn't have mechanics to handle anything and everything. No, most of that was left up to the game master fiat, basically, which I love. But other companies, like our other games, take RuneQuest, for example. They took the concept of fantasy role-playing game and they wanted more comprehensive mechanics behind it, that it could handle way more situations than just generalized combat and some saving throws for outside of combat with just base character abilities. And so that obviously got attention. Traveller, for example, said, hey, we want a more comprehensive rule set that is science fiction in genre. And TSR was taking notes. Gary Gygax was taking notes. In basic Dungeons and Dragons, you didn't have a thing such as a race and a class. You either played a human cleric, a human magic user, a human thief, a human fighter. You could play a dwarf, an elf, or a halfling. Just out of the basic set. That was your choices. There's no such thing as a dwarf cleric, you know? So that was one of the things, you know, that the other games, they sort of changed. But with Dungeons and Dragons, as you created your character, you got certain abilities, okay? And that was the abilities that you had. Now, the problem with that, you know, let's take our fighter, for example. They were great at combat, but they really had no utility purposes whatsoever. So you have a thief over here who has a climbing skill. If you played D&D basic set back in the day, or you play it now, and you have a thief in the party, a low-level thief, hey, that thing's climbing everywhere because it's basically the only thing it can do successfully is climb things. It's like Spider-Man. You know, but they had a climbing ability. The thieves had some other abilities. But what if you're part of the story, or in the part of the dungeon you're in, you need to have your fighter climb up something. And the climb isn't something that's just easy to say, common sense, yeah, he could do that. Maybe it's a very steep climb with slippery walls or something. And yes, it was supposed to be up to Game Master Fiat, which, like I said, I love. That lends more to the storytelling side of role-playing gaming. But a lot of groups wanted, you know, some mechanics for that. Yeah? Another thing about old school D&D, that one thing I didn't particularly like so much about basic Dungeons & Dragons, love the game, but this is a little nitpick thing, is that at character creation, your attributes are very important. After creation and in the game, as your character progresses through the class and level systems, your attributes are almost afterthoughts from that point forward. So like I said, it wasn't a comprehensive rule set is what I'm trying to say. There wasn't a lot of mechanics in there to handle everything. Basically, the mechanics handled magic, save and throws, but the save and throws were limited to things like breath weapons, poison, gas attacks, you know, that kind of stuff. There was no way to resolve mechanically things that weren't written in the book. So more comprehensive systems came out. Now, as time went on, Gary Gygax, I should say. I don't know him. Why am I calling him on a first name basis? Mr. Gygax, if you heard me, I apologize, okay? Okay, by Cromler, I apologize. Don't strike me down before the holiday special. Gary Gygax wrote first edition AD&D. And one thing I love to hear is people in their teens and early 20s and stuff talk about first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. They started playing in 5th edition and they discovered first edition. And they want to tell you all about it. And if you want to, if you're older or if you're familiar with first edition, you can get some great content from these bigger channels of the young crowd, you know, talking about first edition. You want to laugh? There's some material in there you'll be laughing at. Such as the key to first edition Dungeons and Dragons. It was an MMORPG before there was MMORPGs. No. Gygax wrote in the DMG, you know, that what he sought was to make Advanced Dungeons and Dragons the most complete rule set available on the market. And in ways he did do that at the time. Again, there was rules for everything. There just wasn't mechanics. Now, first edition, they improved on a couple of things. They split up class and race. They added a few more classes to the mix and a few more races. They added some more rules for combat, and it got really standardized because that's really the motivation behind first edition AD&D, was to be a very standardized game. Basic D&D was the Wild West. Every table played it differently. It was the same for first edition D&D because it didn't resolve the issues. It gave you more options, but it didn't make the rule set any more comprehensive. You still had players that, you know, that would progress through their class and level system, and they still only had abilities that were listed. There was still no way to mechanically, by the rules, mechanically figure out, or resolve something that wasn't a character class ability. And again, a lot of people started house ruling this stuff to get those mechanics. Again, a fighter comes to a wall. He needs to climb up it. It's a slippery, steep slope. What we used to do, here's your little tip, and I use this for swords and wizardry, is a d20 roll. Match up the attribute that makes sense. For the wall climbing, you would probably consider dexterity or strength. I normally would go with dexterity for that, but you could make an argument for strength, especially if it was a very tall climb. But what we would do is we would add or subtract modifiers. We would roll a d20, and we had to roll equal to or under our attribute score to make a successful roll or a check. That's important if you want to solo play first edition or basic or something like swords and wizardry where those mechanics aren't present. That was just our personal homebrew way of doing it. Now, at around the time of first edition Dungeons and Dragons, an important game hit the scene, at least for me, but I think it was an important game for the history of gaming, and we'll see why later. But Rolemaster hit the scene in the early 80s. And Rolemaster actually started its life as a supplement to Dungeons and Dragons to bring in more realistic, comprehensive combat. Eventually it would go for the magic system, and eventually it would turn into its own game entirely, especially at the second edition of Rolemaster. And many, many other games sprung up in the 80s around Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah? We get toward the mid-80s. Gary Gygax has been pushed out of TSR. The industry is really blooming at this point. People realize that this tabletop gaming phenomenon, there's something to it. People are buying into it. People are really enjoying it. If you're around, you will probably remember the boom of the late 80s and the early 90s, where just about everything in the world, from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to Robotech to our Battletech, I think it was called, to Star Wars to Star Trek, just everything had a role-playing game. TSR came out with second edition Dungeons and Dragons. While first edition was very compatible with basic, second edition was pretty much compatible with first edition. It really didn't add any more comprehensive rules to the game. It added additional rules and additional content, especially in the way of options for player characters. And for sure, campaign settings. Second edition was the game of campaign settings. Too many campaign settings. But they entered the fray with that. Rolemaster had become its own game. Rolemaster was important because I'm pretty sure it was the first game that had a single mechanic that would work for everything in the game. From your combat, to your magic, to your skill checks, what we call maneuvers, static maneuvers and moving maneuvers. That was your ways to check those skills and talents and things that you had. Attribute checks, whatever. It was a D100 roll, and you compared results to get data back to tell you if you succeeded or failed in your roll. Brilliant, brilliant system behind that game. A lot of people look at Rolemaster and they run because of the way it's written. It's really hard to understand if you just pick the books up and start poking around in them. Rolemaster's a big game for me. We'll see it here on the channel. Several editions of it. But it was, it locked down that simple mechanic, and it worked fantastically. And it brought along, with RuneQuest and other more comprehensive games, they broke away from a class and level system where you could really have freedom to create the character you envisioned. So you could have a fighter that could cast magic. You could have a magician that was good with a sword. And it had common sense ways of going about doing it. We don't need to go off and Rollmaster yet, guys. Anyways, just trust me. Way more comprehensive rule sets than anything TSR had put out there. And they were starting to eat into TSR a little bit, along with these other role-playing games. By the mid-90s, we saw the Dark Ages begin with role-playing games. And what happened with role-playing game, the industry at that time, that too many games hit the market because they saw this boom, but there wasn't a big enough customer base or player base to support all these games. TSR themselves made it even worse with Dungeons and Dragons because of all the crazy campaign settings and how much they actually changed the game at the table. I remember back in the day, people, if you talked about role-playing games, a second edition player would tell you they were a second edition Forgotten Realms player. Or what other campaign. They actually identified themselves by campaign setting. But they fragmented the community of D&D, of players, to the point that they went bankrupt. And a lot of games disappeared from the face of the earth in the early 90s and mid-90s. And we sort of entered a dark age there. Now, old school D&D, at its core, let's just talk about its strengths. We've talked about its weaknesses, that mechanically it wasn't very comprehensive. There were technically rules for everything if it just told you to let your game master, our dungeon master, I guess I should say with Dungeons and Dragons, let your dungeon master decide. It's up to him whether you succeed or fail or whatever. Now, that is a weakness in some ways, but it's a great strength in other ways. Especially with basic and especially with first edition advanced Dungeons and Dragons. You had a very free-form class and level system game there. It was, like I said, going from table to table, it was like being in the Wild West. But the game had this atmosphere. That storytelling was great. It was very dangerous games. They could be very deadly. It's not the modern day powder puff D&D where you've got a superhero walking around at level 1. No, there was danger around every corner. Because the rules didn't have all these mechanics, you never truly knew what the game master or the dungeon master might throw out next and what might happen next. And out of all Dungeons and Dragons, it was that wild table experience. And I think in part it was the adventure modules and campaign settings themselves. Some of the most iconic campaign settings and adventure modules came out for basic D&D and first edition. We're talking Temple of Elemental Evil, Keep on the Borderlands, Into the Unknown, Ravenloft, Greyhawk, Blackmoor. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Things that are still going to this day. But the atmosphere, I guess you could say, of how it was played and how it was approached and the deadliness of it or anything, it was just edge on your seat. It was a role-playing game where you literally would hear a table break out in cheers and hilarious, loud laughter, based on a single die roll. And it still does that to this day. Hey, I played, well, technically I play Swords and Wizardry, the complete rule set, when I want that fix, when I want that style of game. I have no problem using, my Moldvay set, for example, or first edition AD&D, but Swords and Wizardry is a little easier for people to obtain. Well, I say that. You can get print-on-demand stuff from Wizards of the Coast now. But Swords and Wizardry it's just, it's a little easier to run, and it's a little easier for people who weren't there to pick up and get an idea for it, unless you want to hold their hand a lot. But you can still get that gameplay nowadays. And I do it quite often, and it's a lot of fun. You know, even through things like Zoom and on the internet and stuff. I don't use virtual tabletops. I'm too old for that. I want real miniatures or no miniatures. Theater of the mind, please. But I've kept my wife up to 6 or 7 in the morning just laughing and having a great time playing Swords and Wizardry with friends online. And we'd look up and realize it was like 7 in the morning. The sun was coming up. Oh, snap, we better go to bed. Or maybe we should go to work today. But yeah, it's just that type of atmosphere. And, you know, when modern D&D came along, things changed. TSR bankrupted itself, basically. Sold out to Wizards of the Coast, who was obtained by Hasbro. Hasbro bought it out, and Wizards of the Coast bought it out. It's technically Wizards of the Coast. They're a Hasbro asset or something, guys. I don't know. And 3rd edition was coming. I think with 3rd edition, they wanted to basically take what Dungeons and Dragons was and reinvent it into something else, because that's exactly what they did. And they sought for it to obviously be more comprehensive. At the time, I think the way of thinking was a new modern game should outdo the other games. You know, for whatever reason. I don't know how to explain it. Let me put my thoughts together here. Give me something to drink, please. They definitely wanted to be more comprehensive, though, to the point that they looked to Rollmaster with that D100 mechanic that was used for everything in the game. That's where they looked to, and they actually brought in people like Monty Cook and stuff to develop 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons was the biggest game release of my lifetime. And what I mean by that, I never remembered the fanfare for another game being released, a tabletop game that is, than 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons had. They built up some big excitement over 3rd edition. There was banners, there were flyers, there were TV commercials. I even heard stuff about it on the radio. There was stuff on the internet. 3rd edition, they went big for it. And it paid off. That was the year it released, 2000. In fact, I can remember the last 2 books came out of the 3 core books. I think they released the Dungeon Master Guide first, somewhere in September, and then the other 2 books released on the same date in October, and it was the Monster Manual and the Player's Handbook. I remember it because it was the first time we skipped school. And we literally drove an hour out of town to go get... That's another story, guys. We'll have to tell that story because it's funny one day. It's funny. But it was the biggest tabletop release I had ever seen. And at that time, I had a really steady gaming group. And we formed this group in the excitement for 3rd edition. About a year before 3rd edition they had already announced it, but it hadn't released. Not a year, probably 8 months or so before 3rd edition, I got together with some of my high school friends that I knew who enjoyed tabletop gaming and stuff. Eddie, Jerry, Clay was there, Josh. And we formed pretty much an everyday after-school D&D group, and we would swap out houses and stuff. Jerry had a car. And Clay had a car, and Clay wasn't supposed to have a car yet. He wasn't old enough to get a license yet. We weren't your typical nerds. We were a wild crew. But stories I could tell, guys. Probably get us thrown off YouTube for the holiday special. Gotta hold back. We gotta hold back till we get the holiday special. By Crimler, we do. But we were playing basic D&D. Jerry's dad introduced us to Rollmaster, which we enjoyed at the time. And we were just enjoying basic D&D for 3rd edition to come out. When 3rd edition hit, of course we skipped school. We had this whole ordeal of getting home and different things. But we took a week to study the rules and bounce things off of each other before we started playing. And it was Dungeons and Dragons in name, but it was not Dungeons and Dragons in game anymore. And what Wizards of the Coast had done was they mimicked the D100 mechanics of Rollmaster, and they wanted to use them with a D20 system under 3rd edition. So we took a look at it. We played it for a while. It was enjoyable. But it wasn't D&D. It didn't feel like D&D. It wasn't as good as Rollmaster either. They had forced a lot of concepts from Rollmaster into the class and level system of traditional D&D. And it ended up being a game that just had way too much bloat to it. You know, this was the edition where the term rules lawyer comes from. By the way, if you came in 5th edition or so. 3rd edition's where the rules lawyer lingo came from. Because that was big. You know, and we couldn't keep up with it. That was the thing that mostly turned us off. That it seemed like every single month there was 2 or 3 new books coming out. With our group, we would have people come in and out of our group, and almost, you know, it was almost a regular thing that somebody would show up with a book that somebody else didn't have, wanting to use stuff out of that book, you know. And another thing was that it was, even though it seemed to have been play tested and stuff, there were several things like the monk, for example. It's just way out of balance. Way out of balance, you know, just as bad as things out of Unearthed Arcana was for 1st edition, by the way. Be careful if you use Unearthed Arcana. That can make a game go pretty bad quick. But anyways, the game had some really bad balancing issues, and it had some very deep flaws, and it wasn't around very long before edition 3.5 came around. By the time 3.5 came around, we were done with 3rd edition. In fact, we went back to playing basic D&D, Rollmaster, and I'd got them a little bit into 1st edition. I had a campaign going on at 1st edition with the First Baptist Church as well, with a Jewish youth leader. I guess couldn't be a minister. It was a First Baptist Church with a Jewish youth leader. I don't know, David. Love him to death. Still talk to him to this day. He ran 1st edition AD&D for us in the church basements on Friday nights. But 3rd edition it wasn't D&D for us. And why do I say that? Another thing that we noticed was how quickly and how powerful the characters got. The excitement was gone, to be honest. It just didn't feel like D&D. The wild nights at the table, the free-form gaming, where you never knew what was going to happen next, that your character's life oftentimes hung on the result of a single die roll. It just changed. The atmosphere of the game was different. And while I absolutely love and oftentimes prefer a more comprehensive rule system than class and level systems, you know, them trying to do it with the class and level system, it just failed for me. And that's really what I consider the end of D&D. 4th edition tried it. Hey, I don't consider it a true role-playing game in a lot of aspects. I consider it to be a game they were specifically developing to sell miniatures and tiles and to take to the computer, which you're about to see with 1 D&D 5th edition players, if you don't believe me. But you could use it for role playing, but I consider it the greatest dungeon crawler ever made. Yeah? And I never got into 5th edition. And for people that would argue that modern D&D, it's better than old D&D and it didn't lose itself and all this kind of stuff, explain the OSR movement and why it's so huge right now. It has been so huge for years now. Yeah? A lot of people that you came in during 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, you might look at these older games and look at it and say, wow, my book's more comprehensive. The rules are better written. I can understand my book. You don't understand what we mean. It's hard to even explain on a video what I'm talking about. That's why I'm staggering around here like a punch-drunk boxer that's been punched a few too many times. But it just lacked the atmosphere. And that's where D&D lost itself for me. So that's what I'm talking about. Old school D&D, it was looking to be more comprehensive and it never really got there. But it was the atmosphere of the game and the way it was played and the excitement of it that even though the rule set wasn't as comprehensive as other games and they never really truly achieved a full comprehensive coherent rule set, that's what made it so popular. That's what gave D&D its name. That's why people played D&D. To be honest with you. It was that atmosphere. It was there. And 3rd edition came along and actually tried to fix that problem. And in doing so, it lost its entire identity as what was before it. What people had loved so much about the first iterations of the game. So how does Castles and Crusades pick up on this? And it's simply that Castles and Crusades, where it is a modern rule set. It's very coherent. It's a fully fleshed out rule set that can handle anything mechanically that you want it to. Yeah? So it has what old school D&D was looking for. And it has the atmosphere. It has the play style of basic D&D and 1st edition. In fact, in many ways, this book is very much what I would consider to be if TSR or Wizards of the Coast or whatever would have thought about it and used some of the background mechanics for 3rd edition on 1st edition. This book actually, Castles and Crusades, actually shares more with 1st edition AD&D than it does any other edition of Dungeons and Dragons, in my opinion. So it has that atmosphere. It has the siege engine. Instead of the modern D&D like 3rd edition 3.5 and such, with the feats and the daily powers and this and that and all kind of stuff. No, it has an attribute check system. It's called the siege engine. It is brilliant. It is very much akin to what we were doing for our house-ruled attribute checks for basic and 1st edition D&D. It's very easy to use. It stays the same throughout the game. And the other parts of the game very much resemble playing, D&D itself. So it has what I've been looking for out of a class and level system. The wild atmosphere, the play by the edge of your seat, exciting dice rolls, etc. But it also has the mechanics that you can use if you want to resolve anything that you need to in game. And notice I said if you want to. Castles and Crusades, they make it clear over and over and over again. It takes the old school D&D attitude that this is your game, play it how you want. The less dice rolling you're doing, the more closer you are to the original game. So it's there if you need it. Now that's very important to me because I oftentimes do want to have it for my solo role-playing hobby. That I don't have a game master in front of me. I'm acting as a game master and a player. So I like to have mechanics to resolve those things. And they've produced such great material for Castles and Crusades. I hate to show, but when we do the deep dive, you guys are going to see how much I have. It's ridiculous. They have several campaign worlds. I think it's pronounced Eard. Okay, it could be Ard, I guess. I don't know. I think technically it comes from an Old Norse word for earth. I think it was Eard. But there's that whole world, and they have maps, and they have campaign setting books, and they have several series of adventures there. And it's a fantastic world. They have the Dragon's Crucible. Oh, the Lord, the name of that world escapes me. I absolutely love that. The adventure modules themselves, they're well written. The art of Castles and Crusades is just beyond good. You know, I had this conversation about art. You know, there's just a little example. You know, that's just a small piece. But I had a conversation today with a good friend of mine and fellow YouTuber, Ian Malcolmson. He runs Willie Muffin channel. He covers a lot of the same stuff and talks about a lot of the same stuff that we do here. Absolutely love his channel. Definitely recommend you go check it out. But we talked about art in game books and how art doesn't make a game book, but poor art or bad art absolutely makes a game book. No. But yeah, Castles and Crusades is delivering it all the way around. And I consider it the ultimate edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Another thing going for it that it's been in publication, I think, since 2004. Just like we talked about with Tunnels and Trolls, just like we'll talk about when we get to the Iron Crown Enterprise games like Rollmaster and stuff, that everything ever made is pretty much straight up or easily compatible with anything else ever made for Castles and Crusades. Another thing that you're going to love about Castles and Crusades is that it is truly a Rosetta Stone of Dungeons and Dragons itself. You can take material from basic, 1st edition, 5th edition, 3rd edition, anything Dungeons and Dragons, and very quickly use it with the Castles and Crusades system. That's why it's referred to as the Rosetta Stone of D&D. So all those old school modules and things that you love from the past, that and even the modern stuff, is just easily thrown to this game. Yeah? I don't know. I love it, guys. We're going to be getting into this. You guys, we're trying to knock basics down around here on the Random Encounter Show. Some deep delves, get some rule systems explained, because when we take off, you're going to be seeing a whole lot of stuff like Castles and Crusades on the table. Definitely recommend it for solo players. Like I said, we're just doing a table talk. Anyways, guys, I don't know how long I've been rambling here. We could talk about D&D and Castles and Crusades for days probably, and eventually we will, when we add up all of our material that we're going to cover these systems. But I'm going to cut it off for tonight. I think it's about 2-something in the morning, and I'm starting to feel the sleep monkeys dance around the table over here. And we've got to go do the next part of the Tunnels and Trolls deep delve. Yeah, that'll be coming out soon too. Anyways, guys, I appreciate you watching the Random Encounter Show. Don't let this be a one-sided conversation. You've got the comment section down below. If you got questions, or if I got something wrong and you want to give your perspective on it or something, or you just want to say hello, drop it down there. I'll be reading them. Anyways, I'm DeathStalker V, and this has been Table Talk on the Random Encounter Show. Hey, this is DeathStalker V. I wanted to thank you for watching the Random Encounter Show. If you love tabletop gaming, solo RPGing, or classic video games, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. If you want more of the show, head over to our channel's About page. There you will find our Facebook and Facebook group pages, where you can join in on the fun. Want to help support the show? Make sure to use our affiliate and sponsor links next time you're shopping for your favorite gaming products. Anyways, I'll see you guys next time when we roll for Random Encounter.